automobiles and shopping centers. Coal ash is not hazardous. EPA determined that fact in regulatory determinations in 1993 and in 2000. The fact that EPA continues to leave a hazardous waste designation for coal ash on the table, even though these 3 decades of science and facts point the other way, is directly contributing to the loss of current and future recycling. This designation would harm companies in the still emerging coal combustion byproduct markets that make everyday products like concrete, shingles, and wallboard. It will also hinder state departments of transportation that use CCB in job-creating highway and infrastructure projects, overwhelm state budgets and employee resources by more than doubling the volume of waste subject to hazardous waste controls, and translates into increased energy rates for millions of American consumers. As a member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, I see no better way to create jobs than to pass the highway bill. During the last highway bill, Pennsylvania received over $10 billion, which created over 400,000 jobs. The coal ash provision in the highway bill only strengthens job creation. Simply put, highway spending strengthens the fabric of our nation's infrastructure while creating jobs for millions of Americans. I urge passage of the gentleman's motion to instruct, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the very distinguished gentleman, ranking member on Energy and Commerce, and I rise in opposition to this motion to instruct conferees to include the Coal Residuals and Reuse Management Act into any final conference agreement on the Surface Transportation Authorization Bill. The bill my colleague seeks to include in the Surface Transportation Bill is bad policy. It has nothing to do with transportation, and it would place communities living downstream from coal ash ponds in real danger. When properly recycled, coal ash and other residuals from burning coal do have economic value. That's not the issue here. But managed improperly, they can be extremely hazardous. Coal ash shouldn't be dumped in unregulated ponds to contaminate groundwater and spill into nearby streams and rivers. In 2008, as Mr. Rush pointed to, the Kingston fossil plant in Tennessee failed to properly maintain its coal ash impoundment pond. The pond collapsed. It dumped 1.1 billion gallons of coal ash slurry into the Clinch River. It inundated several houses with up to 6 feet of ash and mud. And then when they independently tested the Clinch River after the Tennessee Valley Authority impoundment collapse, it showed high levels of arsenic, copper, barium, cadmium, chromium, lead, mercury, nickel, and thallium, all related to that spill. The spill contaminated the water, it killed the fish, and it destroyed property. The cleanup price tag is still being assessed, but it's estimated to cost between $700 and $1 billion. The motion my colleague from West Virginia is proposing would prevent EPA from setting standards for this type of coal ash dump, allowing these problems to continue unchecked. We need to preserve the Environmental Protection Agency's authority to advance regulations that discourage improper disposal of coal ash and to encourage recycling. Every year, coal-fired power plants and industrial boilers in the United States generate about 67 million tons of coal ash and slag and about 19 million tons of coal sludge. While fly ash, bottom ash, flue gas desulfurization mineral, and boiler slag all have a number of beneficial reuses in concrete, roads, wallboard, and roofing, they also contain heavy metals, including lead, arsenic, cadmium, and mercury, as well as radioactive elements. These hazardous components dictate that we must be careful in the handling, reuse, and disposal of the material. Contrary to much of the publicity surrounding the coal ash issue, EPA is not trying to ban the beneficial reuse of coal ash. In fact, EPA proposed 2 separate possible regulatory regimes to encourage recycling and reduce improper coal ash disposal. EPA wants to ensure that coal ash reuse is preserved. while guaranteeing that any disposal is done safely and effectively. EPA's proposed rules received extensive public involvement, including thousands of public comments and 8 public hearings around the country. The Coal Residuals and Reuse Management Act is designed to deprive EPA of the ability to use the best available science in its decisions, and it would negate those thousands of public comments that were received after the rules proposal. It would also give a free pass to power companies to pollute at taxpayer expense. Coal ash is a national, interstate issue and should be subject to federal regulation. As Congress stated when passing the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, the problems of waste disposal have become a matter national in scope and in concern and necessitate federal action. Disposal of solid waste and hazardous waste in or on the land without careful planning and management will present a danger to human health and the environment. That was true in 1976. And 30 years later, it's still true. In the years since, we have found that proper regulation of waste disposal encourages rather than discourages recycling. Implementing environmental and safety controls makes recycling far more attractive and far more likely to occur. 30 years of data on solid and hazardous waste disposal and recycling have borne this out. Let's not revisit the Wild West past of hazardous waste disposal. We need to stand up for the same principles that Congress stated in the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act over 30 years ago. And so that's why I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose the McKinley motion. Prevent more Kingston ash impoundment disasters. They will be replicated, and it will be our fault. We need to allow EPA to regulate responsibly and to allow the beneficial use of coal ash. With that, I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired, and the gentleman from West Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, just before I yield 2 minutes or 3 minutes, 2 minutes to my colleague from West Virginia, I might suggest, with all due respect, I think those that are opposing this amendment, Mr. Speaker, I would encourage them to read the bill. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague from the wild, wonderful West Virginia.
Gentlelady from West Virginia is
Ms.
recognized
Capito.
for 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague, Mr. McKinley from West Virginia, for his solid work on this issue. And I want to say to my colleague from California, who said that this issue is going to hold the Transportation Conference bill hostage, it's absolutely not a fair statement. I'm on the Transportation Conference Committee. We're working day and night in a bicameral, bipartisan way to reach a compromise on a jobs bill. And this coal ash provision is very important. Many Americans are unfamiliar with this, but 40% is used as a raw material to build our highways and our bridges. I was just visiting the Sutton Dam in Braxton County in West Virginia. My colleague talks about the Hoover Dam. We celebrated its 50-year birthday of its construction. It's built with coal ash, and it's just as effective today as it was 50 years ago. It is an essential and safe material to be used in our infrastructure. According to the American Road and Transportation Builders Association, if we don't use coal ash in bridge and road construction, the cost would increase over $100 billion over 20 years. We simply can't afford this. Let's be smart about this. We can find the way, and we've known the way, as the Sutton Dam and the Hoover Dam have shown us. I think we can find a way to safely reduce the cost of constructing our roads and bridges and using coal ash. We have an unemployment of over 8% for 30 consecutive months. We need a transportation bill. We need a smart transportation bill that's going to put America back to work and rebuild our infrastructure. Mr. McKinley's legislation and this motion takes the right approach by giving the states the authority to deal with this. I hope my fellow conferees will work to ensure that this important provision remains in the bill, that we pass the gentleman's motion to instruct. This will not be an obstruction to us passing the transportation bill, and I look forward to passing that bill on the floor in a bipartisan way, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased at this time to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. Today marks the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. Instead of spending the daylight hours passing a clean transportation bill that will help shore up real jobs for Americans, the Congress will be spending the day repealing public health protections and giving away nearly all of our public lands to oil and gas companies in the culmination of the Republican majority's oil above all agenda. It is really a midsummer's nightmare for the American people. But before we get to voting on the Republican oil package, we get to debate whether another Republican bill, whose sole premise is to prevent EPA from following the scientific evidence, should be included in the transportation bill. This bill says that no matter what EPA learns about the sludge that comes out of coal-fired powered plants, no matter how high the concentrations of poisonous arsenic, mercury, or chromium, no matter what EPA learns about how these materials find their way into our drinking water, EPA is forbidden to classify or regulate it as hazardous waste. EPA is forbidden to require that this toxic material be disposed of carefully. This bill turns a blind eye to evidence of known hazards and takes us back to the dark ages, to a time before science was valued and before advanced knowledge transformed society. It takes us back to an era when mercury and arsenic, major components of coal ash, were used to cure toothaches and clear up your complexion. It takes us back to an era where children were sent deep into the bowels of the earth to rip coal from the mines and die early deaths. Apparently, House Republicans not only wish to embrace the principal energy source of the 19th century, they also wish to return us to the 19th century principles about public health and the environment regarding arsenic and mercury and their danger to the citizens of our country. Now, there are good uses for coal ash, beneficial uses. It can be used to construct highways and shingles. That's good. It can be mixed into concrete and grout. That's good. But what we don't want is for the industry to be able to use it to construct a golf course like what they did in Battlefield, Virginia, because it can directly contaminate the groundwater. It can pollute and cause injury and cancers in the neighbors of that golf course. We also don't want it to be disposed of in pits that aren't sealed to handle this special waste, like what happened in Tennessee when a TVA disposal pit collapsed, engulfing an entire small town in toxic sludge. We should have regulations to protect against that ever happening in our country again. This is exactly what this bill, the Republican bill, will do. It will blast us back into the past and allow coal ash to be disposed of without proper construction or monitoring. At the end of this month, transit and highway funding will expire. Hundreds of thousands of jobs are at stake, and our transportation infrastructure will be in peril. Even Senate Republicans have recognized the dangers inherent in allowing this to occur and have joined with Senate Democrats to craft a bipartisan bill so we can put people back to work using coal ash in the highways of our country. But in spite of this, the House Republicans are insisting that unrelated and unnecessary, toxic provisions, dangerous to the health and well-being of Americans, be attached to this bill in order to protect big oil and big coal. Instead of allowing the coal industry and Republicans to transport our country's environmental and public health standards back to the era of Charles Dickens, we should be holding them to higher expectations for the 21st century, for the public health and well-being of our people. I urge a no vote on this preposterous
Gentleman's time has
Republican
expired.
initiative.
The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized.
Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to my colleague, Mr. Renacci from the state of Ohio.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of this motion to instruct the Surface Transportation Bill conferees. The EPA's proposed rule to classify coal ash as a hazardous material is yet another example of this administration's continual attack on coal and the affordable domestic energy it generates. The production and use of coal ash has grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry supporting thousands of jobs in my home state of Ohio. Coal ash is used in more than 75% of the concrete primarily because of its cost effectiveness. Eliminating it would force concrete producers to use expensive alternatives, driving up the cost of building roads and bridges in America by more than $5 billion a year. That means construction costs won't go as far at a time when our infrastructure is in dire need of repair. In addition, classifying coal ash as a hazardous material will prove extremely costly for coal-fired power plants. Some energy companies may analyze the costs and find it simply too expensive to continue operating. Others may attempt to pass the new costs on to consumers in a form of higher utility costs. Either way, the outcome would be devastating for a state like Ohio that derives 80% of its electric power from coal. With our economy still struggling, that is the last thing Ohio businesses, construction companies, and families need right now. Despite decades of research and studies concluding there is no reason to consider coal ash hazardous, many of which the EPA itself carried out, the agency now appears willing to jeopardize thousands of jobs with this inaccurate ruling. It is critical that efforts are taken to prevent the implementation of this regulation. Instead, allow each state to set up their own coal ash recycling programs following existing EPA health and environmental regulations. This approach will protect jobs and our economy in my home state and across America. I applaud Representative McKinley for his continued leadership on this issue, and I urge the conferees to keep the bipartisan House language in the final version of the Surface Transportation Bill. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I now have the pleasure to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, today the House will vote on yet another environmental ruinous bill. This motion would instruct surface transportation conferees to retain the language of H.R. 2273, which prohibits the EPA from regulating coal ash. Coal ash is the toxic combination of mercury, boron, aluminum, thallium, sodium, and arsenic that is produced by burning coal. Shockingly, people living near unlined coal ash ponds have a risk of cancer that is 2,000 times greater than the EPA's acceptable level. Yet this motion would disallow the EPA from doing its job. Allowing the EPA to enforce safeguards against coal ash pollution would help to avoid disasters like the 2008 spill in Tennessee, where a dam holding more than 1 billion gallons of toxic coal ash failed. That spill destroyed 300 acres and dozens of homes, devastated wildlife, poisoned 2 rivers, and apparently taught us nothing. I urge my colleagues to oppose this latest attempt to bar the EPA from saving lives and preserving the environment, and I yield back.
Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes of my remaining time to Mr. Doyle, Congressman Doyle from Pennsylvania.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the gentleman's motion to instruct. Coal ash is a serious issue for this country, and especially for Pennsylvania. Nearly all of my constituents get their power from coal, and with that power generation comes its byproduct, coal ash. It's an unavoidable part of our power generation in southwestern Pennsylvania. And though the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has some of the toughest coal ash disposal standards in the country, I've been convinced that coal ash needs to be federally regulated under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. However, This motion to instruct does not fully encompass my position on the issue. Though this motion to instruct calls on conferees to insist upon House language on coal ash, that's not the whole story. In fact, I support the coal ash language in the bipartisan group that senators are working on. I've seen much of the work they've been doing, and I can tell you I believe it to be an improvement on what we're doing here in the House. The question is, will the conferees agree to a bill at all, and will it include coal ash? My vote in favor of this motion is meant to urge my colleagues to finish the process so we can resolve the coal ash issue in a way that's good for the environment, our constituents, and the purposes of recycling these materials. I want to make it clear I do not believe that any coal ash or Keystone provisions should be used to hold up the Transportation Bill Conference. Above all else, it's essential that this Congress does its job and completes the Highway Bill Conference before the current program expires on June 30th. I continue to support the federal regulation of coal ash as a non-hazardous waste. I encourage my colleagues to work quickly towards a bipartisan, bicameral resolution on this issue, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California. Sorry, gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I want to yield at this time 3 minutes to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Does the gentleman from West Virginia seek to yield time? From where? Gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized. The gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 3 minutes. Without objection.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, yet another summer building season is well underway without a long-term transportation bill. And we are, quite frankly, down to the wire on the current funding authorization, which expires next Sunday. And yet, here we are debating the addition of even more non-transportation related measures. Now, Congressman McKinley's motion to instruct on coal ash is yet another example of delay. The transportation conferees ought to be urgently completing their work on a long-term authorization not saddled with extraneous requirements which pose a threat to public health. With thousands of jobs on hold until Congress acts, this delay is unconscionable. Now, our state departments of transportation gave us early warning that if the Congress does not act and did not act on a long-term transportation bill by March 31st, the summer building season would be compromised. Now, the Senate recognized this concern and sent to the House bipartisan legislation known as MAP 21, a bill which passed the Senate with a strong bipartisan support of 74 senators. And yet, as we saw March 31st deadline come and go, House leadership refused to take up the bipartisan Senate bill, knowing full well that carrying an extension into the summer building season would cost jobs. And it has. Now, nowhere is our nation's fragile recovery more apparent than in my home state of Rhode Island, which currently has an unemployment rate of 11%. Now, according to RIDOT, millions of dollars in projects have already been delayed, including a $6.4 million project to carry I-95 over 10 Rod Road in Exeter, Rhode Island, a $1.5 million project to provide traffic improvements on I-295 ramps along borders of Cranston and Johnston, a $3.5 million project to resurface State Street to Broad Street and Main Street to Route 1A in Westerly, Rhode Island. These projects not only improve the infrastructure upon which our businesses and residents rely, they mean real jobs, desperately needed jobs for Rhode Islanders. Now, MAP 21 will help rebuild America's economy on a stronger, more sustainable foundation. It will provide financing for critical highway and transit projects and support almost 2 million jobs, 9,000 of them in my home state of Rhode Island. Now, a 90-day extension, Mr. Speaker, is almost up. It was reluctantly passed back in March with the promise of a long-term measure to follow, a bill which is yet to materialize. Now, we, Mr. Speaker, must let the conferees finish their work, let the EPA continue to do its job protecting the public from the risks of coal ash, which include cancer, neurological disorders, birth defects, and asthma. I urge my colleagues to vote against this industry-driven motion and to vote for moving forward on the path to rebuild our roads, our communities, and our economy by bringing the American people a long-term transportation bill. With that, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my colleague from Texas, Mr. Olson.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of my good friend, Mr. McKinley, in his efforts to include the Coal Residuals Reuse and Management Act in the final Transportation Authorization Bill. EPA's goal of issuing new federal rules to regulate coal combustion residuals will have far-reaching and negative impacts on our economy. These EPA rules would severely hamper American energy production, thereby risking our nation's ability to meet the electricity generation we need to grow our economy and get our country back on track working again. President Obama wants to eliminate coal as a source of energy for America. And this should come as no surprise to those who have listened to President Obama's comments when he was a candidate for office. He spoke from his heart in San Francisco in 2008. And here's a summary of what he said. And this is a quote. Let me sort of describe my overall policy. What I've said is that we would put a cap and trade system in place that is as aggressive, if not more aggressive, than anybody else's out there. He later said, so if somebody wants to build a coal-powered plant, they can. It's just that it will bankrupt them because they're going to be charged a huge sum for all the greenhouse gas that's being emitted. We need common sense at EPA and a president who understands that an all-the-above strategy includes American coal. And that is why I'm supporting Mr. McKinley's Coal Residuals Reuse and Management Act in the final Transportation Authorization Bill. I urge my colleagues to vote for Mr. McKinley's motion to instruct conferees. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Thanks. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Could we reserve at this point in time, Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman reserves? Mm-hmm. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the next 2 minutes of my time to my colleague from West Virginia, Mr. Rahal.
Gentleman from West Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from West Virginia for yielding, my good friend, and I commend him for his dogged determination on this issue, his patience and persistence, and I certainly rise in support of this motion to instruct. This gentleman from West Virginia was, after all, the Democratic floor manager of the House bill, which got us into conference with the Senate, who accepted the amendment offered by Mr. McKinley, which passed by voice vote on April 18th. This amendment, known as the coal ash provision, is an important provision, and I, like many others, do not want to see it derail the entire transportation bill in its entirety, but I think if this body were to follow the instructions of the House, both in this motion and in the previous motion adopted by Mr. Waltz of Minnesota, which instructed conferees to report back by June 22nd, then I believe we would have a transportation bill that this nation would benefit from and our American workers would benefit. Since 1980, the EPA has struggled to figure out whether coal ash should be regulated under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and if so, in what fashion. As of this date, 32 years later, no EPA regulation is in place. The agency had its shot, and now it's time to move on. The provision by the House is aimed at the states bolstering their programs governing the regulation of coal ash and includes enforcement actions if they fail to do so. Given the nexus between the use of coal ash and the manufacturing of cement and that product's use in our transportation system, it is an appropriate matter to be considered within the scope of the conference of the transportation bill. And contrary to some remarks we've heard on the floor today, these motions to instruct do not delay the work of conferees. Being a conferee myself, I know that the conference continues to meet with proposals going back and forth. We're currently playing ping pong on a lot of these proposals, but that's good. It means that we're talking, and it means the process is going forward, and I'm just very optimistic and hopeful that we can reach an agreement sooner rather than later so that America's economy can continue to recover and American workers can go back to work with certainty. Thank you. I yield
Gentleman's
back.
time has expired. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
May I inquire of the chair how much time is remaining on both sides?
The gentleman from Massachusetts has 5½ minutes remaining. The gentleman from West Virginia has 9 minutes remaining.
Yes. Could I continue to reserve the balance?
Gentleman from
of my time?
Massachusetts continues to reserve. Gentleman from West Virginia.
He's got 1 minute. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes of my time to Mr. Whitfield from Kentucky.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 2 minutes.
I rise today to support Mr. McKinley's motion to instruct conferees to the Highway Transportation Bill to stop EPA from regulating coal ash as a hazardous material. Since the formation of EPA has looked periodically at coal ash. Most recently, they did it in 1993 and 2000 under the Clinton administration and came to the conclusion that coal ash does not warrant being regulated as a hazardous waste. The only difference today and then is that this administration is determined to put the coal business out of business. And yet America gets about 48% of its electricity from coal. We cannot expect to meet the demands of this nation's electricity needs over the next 20 years without coal. If EPA is successful in treating coal ash as a hazardous waste, which is quite radical, we know that independent analysis have shown that the cost associated with road and bridge building in America will increase by more than $100 billion over a 20-year period. And in America today, to stimulate our economy, to get our goods to market, we need to improve the infrastructure of this country. And at this time in our nation's history, with the economic problems that we have, to be trying to increase the cost for construction to meet the vital needs of this country is really unconscionable, particularly when there's been no causal relationship found between coal ash and health problems. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California, continue to reserve.
Yes, we continue to reserve.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the next 2 minutes of the time remaining to Mr. Kritz from Pennsylvania.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and thank you to the gentleman for West Virginia for yielding. I rise today in support of the McKinley motion to instruct conferees, asking that the bipartisan supported coal combustion residuals program language from H.R. 4348 be retained in the final transportation reauthorization bill. Coal ash is of critical importance as it is contained in the composition of the concrete used in our roads, bridges, and other infrastructure. The use of coal ash in transportation has allowed our country to maintain lower costs for infrastructure building. Studies have shown that coal ash costs 20 to 50% less than other products on the market today during a time when our roads are deficient and we need solutions that are cost efficient. Coal ash serves as a reliable resource. We need to invest in materials that will allow us the highest return on investment and stretch our highway dollars for needed improvements. In addition to the cost saving that this will provide, including this language is also critical to support our environment and nearly 300,000 jobs that rely on coal ash use across the nation. In western Pennsylvania, I've witnessed the importance of coal ash to many communities in my district and surrounding areas. We have seen a transformation from orange skies and orange streams to an area whose beauty has been restored thanks to the safe use of coal ash for landfill, transportation use, and other purposes. For these reasons, I strongly urge my colleagues to include in the final conference report the McKinley language so critical to our nation's economic and infrastructure needs. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from California continue to reserve.
Mr. Speaker, I want to yield myself 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
The way I understand the argument on the other side is that if EPA regulates coal ash and calls it hazardous, that stigma will lead construction companies to avoid it as a building material. Is that, if I could address the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, is that an accurate statement that you're fearful of the designation of it and the stigma of that designation as hazardous? Yield to the gentleman.
You say, is there going to be a stigma?
Is your fear that if EPA regulates coal ash and it's called hazardous, that designation will be a stigma and will lead to the non-use of coal ash in by construction companies as a building material?
Mr. Congressman, I believe there is a stigma associated with the with that pending decision. Yes.
That is your fear.
There is a stigma associated with the misinformation that's been disseminated. That's correct.
Well, my colleagues, the thing that is so confusing to me is that coal ash is often used as a substitute for Portland cement in concrete. It lowers the costs, it reduces the waste, reduces the greenhouse gas emissions, and we don't need to pass legislation to have that happen. But I want to point out that Portland cement is designated as hazardous. It's a hazardous chemical under the OSHA Hazard Communications Rule. It's a hazardous substance under the Superfund amendments. It's a hazardous substance under Federal Hazardous Substances Act, and it's hazardous material under the Canadian Hazardous Products Act. But Portland cement continues to be used extensively in concrete and transportation projects. Now, EPA, I yield myself an additional minute. EPA
Recognized for an additional 1 minute.
is not seeking to call coal ash hazardous. They want to call it a special waste. But even if they called it hazardous, why would it not be used the way Portland cement is now used, even though that substance is designated as hazardous in all these other statutes?
No, I'm just going to say. Sure. My colleague paid attention to the amendment. The amendment is to allow, what we're trying to do is allow more time for the conference committee to work, rather than to debate the pros and cons of the environmental aspects of it. We want the committee to continue to work to reach a compromise. And I've been told there's been great progress being made on that. But don't stop at this 11th hour. They're close to making it happen. We want to stand beside them and make sure they finish their work on these negotiations. Where they are,
well, reclaiming
Mr.
my
Waxman,
time,
I'm speaking through the chairman.
Yeah,
Mr.
reclaiming my
Speaker.
time, and I yield myself one additional minute, which
The
may
gentleman
be
is
the last
recognized
minute.
for 1 additional minute.
The reason I ask for more time is, as I understand the McKinley bill, which was adopted by the House, it would prohibit EPA from regulating coal ash because it would be designated possibly as hazardous, and the argument has been that that would be a problem to be used as a substance for concrete and building materials. But I don't believe that to be the case. Now, I think that the committee with the Senate and the House ought to complete its business. But I don't think your amendment is needed under any circumstance. And that's why I would urge members to vote against this instruction, because it is trying to interject in that highway bill something that's really not part of the highway bill and something that on its own should not be adopted in the form of the McKinley bill. And if I have any further time, I reserve it. If not, I'll yield it back. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have remaining?
Gentleman from West Virginia has 5 1/2
minutes.
minutes remaining. Okay. Gentleman from California has
Mr.
1
Speaker,
1/2 minutes.
I yield 2 minutes of my time to my fellow engineering colleague from the state of Texas.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes. Without objection. To order.
I thank the gentleman from Arkansas for that non-objection. I wasn't planning on speaking on this bill, but I was listening in my office to the debate between the proponents and opponents of the bill and felt moved to come over and try to answer some of the questions that the opponents have asked of the bill. EPA is supposed to be a fair referee. They're supposed to, if it's a strike, it's a strike. If it's a ball, it's a ball. If he's out, he's out. If he's safe, he's safe. But the Obama EPA is not a fair referee. It's not a fair umpire. The Obama EPA has a preconceived, what I consider to be radical environmental agenda, and they appear heck bent to impose it on the American people, whether there is a scientific rationale or not. As Mr. Olson of Texas just pointed out, the president as a candidate said that basically he wanted to try to make it impossible to build any more coal-fired power plants in America. When he became president, he appointed a regional administrator down in Texas, Dr. Armendariz, who said that he wanted to try to put hydraulic fracturing out of business, and brought a case against Range Resources in Texas that was thrown out on its face because of the lack of evidence that there was any environmental damage caused by hydraulic fracturing in the specific case in Parker County. You had the civil servant at the EPA early in the Obama administration when they were considering their endangerment finding, which they had to impose in order to say they could regulate greenhouse gases. They had a career civil servant who sent a detailed, I think, 50 or 60-page analysis of the proposed endangerment finding and basically said it was hogwash. And he got back emails from within the White House and the higher rankings at the political subdivisions at the EPA that said, don't tell us the facts, we've already made up our mind. This same Dr. Armendariz made a comment not too many years ago that he wanted to crucify industry. Wanted to crucify. He since resigned because of those comments. So those of us that support the McKinney amendment or the McKinney bill do so because we don't think the current EPA is fair. Sometimes we have to tell the EPA what to do because they seem to be incapable of applying basic scientific methods, scientific principle. They want to impose a radical environmental agenda, apparently, and some of us don't think that's right, and we don't think it's good for the American people, the American economy. So I strongly support what my good friend from West Virginia is doing, because it at least makes it possible for a source that for years and years and decades has been used without any problem at all to continue to be used. And I think that's a good thing. So I rise in support. I thank the gentleman for the time, and I hope the House will adopt his motion to instruct conferees.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, my colleagues, gentleman from Texas told us he came here, he was so moved to come here to correct the record, and he told us three things that are absolutely inaccurate. The President has never said he doesn't want to build new power plants in this country. It is not true. The gentleman from Texas who worked for the EPA never said that this administration or that he personally was against hydraulic fracturing. It's just not true. And the analysis of the endangerment finding by the Bush administration was signed off not by just a career diplomat, career civil servant, but by the head of the EPA appointed by President Bush. So when you get these wrong statements in your head, you can dream up a reason to be paranoid about EPA. EPA wants to protect the public health and safety in regulating coal ash, but in doing so, they will not prevent coal ash from being used for other building purposes. And I would urge that we defeat this motion to instruct, and I yield back whatever seconds I have left.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I request the right to close, and I don't know whether he has any more time.
The gentleman from California has yielded back his time. Gentleman is recognized for the remaining 2.5
more minutes. Mr. Speaker, it's fairly obvious that a lot of the folks that have been speaking on the other side of this issue have not read the bill and don't understand what's included in the provision. But perhaps reading the bill reading the amendment would have given them greater insight as to the role of the EPA, because we are, by virtue of this amendment, we are giving them great insight, great involvement in the proper disposal of the amount of fly ash that's not recycled. So, Mr. Speaker, it really just comes down to this issue being very clear. Our opponents are just opposed to the coal industry. They're opposed to the men and women working in our coal industry. They're opposed to the 700 plus coal-fired electric utilities. They're opposed to keeping utility costs low. There is a war on coal, Mr. Speaker, and it's time that we stand up for the coal workers, the men working in the coal fields all across the United States, and for the men and women and the consumers that use electricity at low cost. Now, let's go to what the Department of Interior and Transportation have said, that they concur that if fly ash is designated a hazardous waste, as is being considered, fully or in a hybrid classification, it will no longer be used in concrete. That's from the Department of Interior. They've also said that fly ash costs approximately 20 to 50% less than the cost of cement. Department of Interior. Department of Transportation, fly ash is a valuable byproduct used in highway construction. It's a vital component of concrete and a number of other infrastructure uses. Mr. Speaker, I ask all my colleagues to join me today in supporting this motion to instruct the conferees to continue discussing this bipartisan negotiations on this part of the highway bill, and ask their senators to do the same. Let's maximize the use of all the money that we have available to build more roads, rebuild more bridges, do more infrastructure, but most importantly, put America back to work. So I encourage my colleagues to vote for this motion to instruct, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Is time. Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider.
Mr. Speaker, I demand the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. What are they looking for? Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on my motion to instruct conferees on H.R. 4348.
Without objection. So ordered.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker,
for what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
I would ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks on the legislation and to insert extraneous material on H.R. 4480.
Without objection. Pursuant to House Resolution 691 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 4480. The Chair appoints the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Womack, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
In the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 4480, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to provide for the development of a plan to increase oil and gas exploration, development, and production under oil and gas leases of federal lands under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of the Interior, and the Secretary of Defense, in response to a drawdown of petroleum reserves from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 2 hours, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce and the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, and the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the price of gas and the unemployment rate both remain way too high, and American families are struggling as a result.